An ambivert, that's definitely me. And I think that is actually the case with a lot of writers. You have to become that because you have to be able to cultivate the social, the public-facing side of you to be successful. But if you did that all the time, then what would happen to the writing?
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Anne Morgan, a novelist and non-fiction writer, and this episode I'm delighted to be joined by fellow non-fiction author and books journalist and fellow RLF Collected presenter, Caroline Sanderson. Since the year 2000, Caroline has written non-fiction previews for The Bookseller, where she is an associate editor. And she has also written books about Adele, Jane Austen, children's games, and a children's book about Greece. Her most recent book, Listen with Father, a book of remembrance, is a fantastic and intriguing exploration of her relationship with her father through 8 pieces of classical music. And so it's going to be wonderful to talk to her today to hear a bit more about the background behind that book and more broadly about her experience writing and working in very different media over more than 25 years. Now, we always start these episodes with talking about a topical slot. And a bit like The Bookseller, Caroline, we work rather far ahead here at Collected. So this episode is going out in August. Now, I know with you and your previews, you think several months ahead. So you're always reading several months ahead, aren't you? So in August, what sort of books are you reading? What time slot are you focusing on at The Bookseller?
Oh gosh, well, August, I'm right at the end of the calendar year. So December is actually the one publishing month that's quite quiet. But we're starting to get a bit of new year, new you coming through. So a few diet, self-help books, that kind of thing. But very much looking forward to the new year, actually. So by the time we're coming out of summer and into autumn, I'm well past Christmas.
Oh, wow. Gosh, that must be quite disorientating. Or have you got used to it now? I mean, this must be the shape of your year, sort of living several months ahead like that all the time now.
Yeah, it's very much the shape of my year. I mean, it's quite a strange thing because, you know, people know that I read a lot of books and I write about books. And so people are quite want to come up to me and say, oh, well, what have you read recently? What's coming out that you could really recommend? And of course, I have to then stretch my mind back sort of 4 months and try and think about what they could possibly read for nonfiction summer reading, you know, when I'm in a completely different month. So it's slightly disorientating, but, you know, it's such a wonderful job to have. I think if you told me that, one day I'd be paid to read, I mean, albeit not very much, I mean, I think I'd have bitten your hand off, so.
Absolutely. You must get hundreds of books pitched to you all the time. What makes a good book pitch? How does something catch your attention? Is there anything that tends to work for you in terms of making you want to find out more about a book?
Well, I think the best publicists, and that's who the pitches normally come from. I mean, I suppose they know the kind of thing that I've really, really loved in the past. But I think it's just, unusual takes on things or different points of view. I mean, I think, you know, one of the glories of reading, as we know, is that it teaches you about places, people, other lives that you have no knowledge of. So I'm always interested in a completely different perspective. I think just last year I interviewed an indigenous woman called Namontin Nkimo, who's from a tribe in Ecuador and had written about the destruction of the rainforest in Ecuador. I mean, that's just an extraordinary opportunity to hear from and to read the words of somebody whose experience is completely, you know, kind of other from mine. And so, of course, that's always very tantalizing, really, the opportunity to hear from people, you know, in other parts of the globe, as you know from your own work. One thing that I have to try and do is cover genres. So in as much as memoir is very much the forefront because, you know, that's in a way the easiest things to pitch because you've got a very distinct story to pitch. Actually, I'm trying to cover, you know, everything from, you know, sort of health books right through sort of history and even gardening. I say even gardening just because it's a much smaller area of publishing, but nothing's off limits in that sense, you know, but it's got to be something which I feel I've not really read in quite that way before, I suppose. And The other thing is that we do interview authors who've got a significant back catalogue from time to time. I interviewed Olivia Laing last year, for example. I've interviewed Richard Mabey, but we sort of accentuate new voices, I think, because our primary audience is booksellers, librarians, people, an expert independent bookseller doesn't need to be told about Olivia Laing, in a way, but they do need to be told about an author that they're not familiar with.
Mm. And have you found that things have changed dramatically over the last 25 years? I mean, it seems to me that publishers are working further ahead in some ways. So we're hearing about books. I almost feel if I buy a book when it comes out now, I'm behind the curve. Everyone seems to have read it already 6 months before. I mean, is that just my perception, or is that how it
I think it might be people you're associating with.
Maybe.
I mean, I get this with fiction because I'm always behind the curve with fiction because fiction has to wait most of the time. And I do read fiction and love fiction as well. So I think certainly my perspective is very, very skewed of what the sort of average, reader is, their experience of, what's on the horizon and what they feel like is the latest hot book. I think one thing that's changed very much in terms of the time during the time in which I've been writing my previews, when I first started doing them, the amount of information online, well, there was no information online. So really what the bookseller was doing was presenting a sort of glorified catalogue or listing really of the books that were coming out, because that was really the only place that you could sort of find it in one place. And so my previews were pretty dull because you weren't expected to put in your personal opinion or you weren't supposed to kind of amplify things really in any way. But over the years, the job, of course, has got much, much more interesting. It's got much more time consuming in the process as well, because now, any bookseller can find out what's coming out, with a few clicks of the keys. But what, of course, we all need is someone to help us navigate through this huge amount of publishing that's going on. Every month there are hundreds of books coming out, not to say thousands, and particular times of year, September, October. I mean, it's just vast. So what, in that word, curated, that's really what people need. They need somebody to sort of say, okay, I have the lovely privilege of being among the first readers of books, very often doing first interviews. I've done first interviews with a lot of authors who've gone on to have big successes, which is great. Helen Macdonald H's for Hawke is one that comes to mind. Philippe Sands for East West Street. So being among the very first readers of those books was a great privilege. But that's just also the good fortune of the magazine I happen to write for, having to be ahead of the curve. But yes, it is a very curious sort of time frame, being ahead of when a book's published, and we know as writers that we are doing so much before a book even hits the shelves, not just the writing it, but all the editing and the whole process. It's generally a very slow process.
Well, it's time now for our first archival slot from the Royal Literary Fund archives. And to get us thinking about another aspect of your career, Caroline, we've got Vayu Naidu talking about the festival experience.
Festivals open out worlds with words. It's really about travel. Whether it is the ends of a country or the world or the local bookstore, it is about our minds traveling with words as signs on a page, and then in the air sketching a meaning. Listening to a panel of writers having the freedom to express and answer the contradictions and leave some questions unsolvable is part of the buzz of being alone and together. The buzz is also about an audience traveling together with the imagination to make meaning of something not entirely understood. The open cafes, translations, nearly new friendships because ideas have been simmering like old passions now bearing fruit, is all part of the kasbah of literature festivals I've enjoyed inhabiting. These festivals of words are a performative theatre of ideas, practice of philosophies, invention of histories, the craft of aesthetics, the politics of language, the timelessness of the now. Festivals design patterns and shape avenues for teachers, secondary school attenders, eternal students thirsty for the rare. It's the way venues throw open their wares and live music, mood, drink, voices, accents, rants, raves all swerve into the festivity of culture that is a breathing cosmopolis, that festival experience. In the act of recalling this, there is a distinct craving for this. While every certitude of collective live interaction has been swept away by the swirling coronavirus, sponsors and charities have to rethink. Festivals of literature have fought on. It's meant a huge investment in technology, and following the summer lockdown of early glitch interviews, the festival experience has changed, but is present in new ways. The festival experience is as much about the craft of writing and the pulsating energy of the contemporary audience. No two festival years can be the same, even if it is the same curator and staff. And that is not just because a new set of books and publishers have come in, or the audiences have grown bigger, or the prizes just got better. Literature festivals can be like jazz. It's a known song, but each singer makes it sound so different with the unique chemistry of the three Aristotelian unities of time, action, and space. Some curators test your stamina of how much you take in and challenge your conservatisms. Going to these as a writer listening is very different from going as an audience member seeking writers. It's good to meet someone who does not have the same interest as you. It opens a window of what else is around that could surprisingly change your experience. Among my favorites are LSE Writers' Festival, the Pen Writers and Translations at London Book Fair, then crossing the wide Brahmaputra Writers About Holocausts, the Byron Bay Literature Festival for Women in Science, Bhutan for Environment Perspectives. The Jaipur Literature Festival internationally has curated literary talent with freedom of expression, a range of writers who are critical to the festival experience on a global platform of culture.
So, Caroline, I know you speak at and chair events at many festivals, but also since 2018, you've been co-director of Stroud Book Festival. And I wondered, that's a massive job. Can you tell me about that? What does that involve? And why is it important to you to do that work?
Well, I moved to Stroud in Gloucestershire 20 years ago. And Stroud is an amazingly cultural place for its size. It's full of musicians and artists and writers. And there was talk, in the town and in the bookshop for a long time about starting a literature festival. But it was one of those things that would anyone actually take it on? And I didn't take it on. The writer, Jamila Gavin, took it on. And then after a couple of years, I took it on because she had, given it a wonderful foundation, but it was essentially quite local. And I think my experience at other literature festivals had made me think, I wonder, we had wonderful audiences, very engaged politically, very curious. And it has always felt like a place really crying out for a book festival. But what I wondered was whether we could, this is getting down to the sort of brass tacks, literally, but could we raise the money essentially to do a festival and pay everybody, which wasn't happening before, which I feel very passionately about supporting, creativity and, paying everybody who contributes. So, yes. So I was lucky enough to meet, my co-director, Shannon, who is an experienced fundraiser, but also brilliant at putting on events. So finding the right people kind of coalesced around it. And that enabled us really to start thinking about being able to kind of raise the money to put on a sort of, shall we say, all singing, all dancing festival. And it's tough, it's difficult, it's scary, it's really scary. And the climate hasn't got any easier, I must say. But I felt that I could channel a lot of a good experience into it, both of event managing and of chairing and of attending literature festivals. And I'm in a privileged position of getting a little bit of advance warning of what's coming down the line. So all those things seem to kind of come together. And also, I love where I live, and I really wanted to sort of contribute to the life of the town. So that was behind it, really. It's a lot of work. It's essentially a crazy side hustle, but very rewarding.
Did anything that Vayu said resonate with you particularly about festivals? I mean, she made many points about their value, particularly about their connectivity, I suppose, reaching across worlds. And she said, no 2 years are the same. I wondered if...
That really resonated with me, actually. And you really feel that every year has its particular character. And also because I think we're a deliberately quite current affairs-led festival because, as I said, people are very engaged in current events, which it's a kind of dreamed program in that sense. But yeah, no two festival, I think outside events sort of make that so as well, and just the times that we're living in and so on. But yes, it is fascinating how every festival takes on its own character, I suppose, because you've got a completely different range of authors who bring to it kind of individual takes and styles that they have. I loved her descriptions of, festivals as sort of this cosmopolis because, in as much as we have a lot of writers in Stroud and, there's always a kind of slight balance to be struck between supporting our local writers, there's part of me that feels, well, actually, in a way, that can happen any time of year. And the mission for Stroud really has become so much about bringing in writers from elsewhere, ideas from elsewhere, helping people, just sort of broaden their horizons, people of all ages, really. And that's very important to me, actually. So, because I think, writers anywhere are better writers for that community that we're all part of, that global community of kind of ideas and creativity.
What makes for a good event? Do you need a bit of conflict? Do you need a particular synergy between the panelists? Is it the chair? Is it just a sort of indefinable frisson with the audience? Or what are you looking for when you're putting together an event? What's the magic?
Oh, God, that's such a difficult question to answer. It's a great question. I don't know, and I don't know whether I can almost put it into words. I've seen lots of events which don't quite spark off, and it's very often hard to know why that is. I think very, very hard about whether an event is going to work, partly for economic reasons, but also partly perhaps overthink whether people will really go for it. A good chair is obviously absolutely vital. There's a real art to it that's often not well appreciated. Chairs are not very well remunerated for all that goes into being a really excellent chair. That's something that I do feel, quite strongly about. I know some fantastic chairs who are able to kind of almost like turn on a sixpence from one event to the other and do a great job. But yes, of course, you're trying to program panelists who, there are different takes on one subject. It's not necessarily a conflict, but, they might be coming at it from a slightly different point of view. I can think of one event I programmed for Stroud last year, which has the author Madeleine Bunting, who'd written a book about the seaside and seaside places, but very much looking at them being on the margins, and that a lot of people who are on the margins being sort of drawn to those seaside places. So getting away from the kind of buckets and spades romanticism. And Natasha Carthew, a working class writer who grew up in Cornwall and so has that very particular sense of what that's like in a place which is kind of overrun by tourists. So they're coming at a similar sort of discussion, but from very different. So that's always good, I think.
Fantastic. We're going to move on to our craft slot now. And I'm so fascinated to talk to you about this, Caroline, because I loved reading Listen with Father, your new book. It's described as a book of remembrance. You call it that in the opening pages. Can you give us a bit of background to the book and the thinking behind it?
Yes. Well, my father died of cancer in 2013. It was a very difficult time, of course. And I was grieving, and I read a lot of grief memoirs. I mean, it's an almost universal experience. And I think Helen MacDonald in H is for Hawke says something like, grief is universal, but we all have to feel it in our own way. And I think that's very, very true. But what I was more interested in with Listen with Father is, how do we remember somebody? Once the sort of first phase of the grief has passed and you're into that thing of where are they within me? What is it that reminds me of them? Where are they still present in my life? And how can I sort of perpetuate them in some way, really? And there are the ways that we all know. So that could be, I don't know, going to visit a grave, or it could be looking at photographs of them. But I really started thinking a lot about ways in which I could actively remember my father. And classical music seemed to be an obvious way of doing it, because he wasn't a musician. He wasn't a musical in that sense. He wasn't an aficionado. He was a listener to classical music from an early age. He discovered it at school. He was in a sort of music club at his grammar school, back in the 40s. And there was a sort of lunchtime listening club for the sixth formers. And the master would put on a record, and they would all sit and listen to it and then talk about it. And this captivated him, and he carried on listening to music throughout his life. And I'm afraid that I had some very early experiences of him playing me music, which I remember very vividly. It did make an impression on me. But then I got into pop music, and I kind of, just sort of really stopped listening to it, despite his best efforts to try and encourage me. And after he died, I realized that I really regretted that, because it could have been a real point of, connection between us. But also I thought, well, actually, through listening to it, even now, it's a point of connection. So I chose 8 composers, 7 composers and 1 singer, actually, who, had a connection with Dad. I remember him listening to them, or we'd listen to something together. My mission really was to listen to them very carefully and then try and write about it. Writing about music is famously difficult. But anyway, that's the job I set myself.
Well, what's so fascinating about the book is it's not just backwards looking. It's not a nostalgic book so much as a forward-looking book in many ways, in that you're reinventing yourself through the process of writing it, I think, in that you're trying to find a new way of writing about music. Because you say, this is not something that comes naturally to me or that I feel very comfortable with. And for me, that really resonated, because my book, Relearning to Read, which comes out later this year, is also very much about dealing with limitations. It's about trying to find a new framework for talking about books and for reading, how we do that. And so I really resonated. You said at one point, I'm scared of being an inadequate listener. And there's something so refreshing and so engaging about your openness and your willingness to expose your vulnerability. And you do find an incredibly powerful way to write about music. You weave together 3 or 4 strands. There's your own story and your memory of your father. There's the story of the musicians and the composers involved in making the music. And then there's a lot of historical background as well around other things that kind of connect with theory of how we listen and what goes on in our brains. Thinking with our craft hat on, how did you go about finding that balance, weaving those different strands together in the way that you do that feels really even and satisfying?
Well, thank you. That's wonderful to hear. And I like what you were saying about it being a forward-looking book, because I did sort of want it to be that, because I wanted people to engage in it in an active way, to feel that they could maybe do something similar, because I am no expert on classical music, and any classical music expert that reads this will probably find great, things to laugh at it in a way. But yes, all my favourite nonfiction books, I think, are a blend. It's very difficult to say what they are. Are they memoir? Are they history? Are they travel? And I suppose that's what I've always aspired to write myself. But it's hard. It's hard because, don't want to say memoirs are easy to write. They're not. But there's a sort of straightforwardness about telling a chronological life story. And this is not that, even though, as you said, it has elements of memoir. about myself, but also I'm writing about my dad. But I really wanted to combine all those different elements in it. I mean, it's got travel in it as well. I mean, I went to quite a lot of places when I was writing the book.
Because you got locked in the Paris Opera.
I got locked in the Paris Opera. I went to Salzburg on the Mozart Trail, and I went, most amazingly, really, of all for me, was I went to Finland for the first time because one of the composers in the book is Sibelius. So there was that going on as well. So it did take a long time to write because I was trying to find that sort of blend in each chapter of all those things. But when I managed to find it, I think for me that's the most satisfying thing as a writer, is to be able to sort of combine the different genres in a way, because that's what I find most interesting to read.
Mm. Were there any kind of books that you read that you sort of thought of as frameworks or models or things that inspired you in any way in the process?
Not really. I wanted to do something that I hadn't really encountered, which is this sense of remembrance rather than grief. So I'm hoping that people take that from him, because although obviously the book is about somebody who's grieving, and you do feel that in places, that's not really the main point of it. So I felt that I hadn't really found that. But yes, I mean, I read a huge amount from biographies of composers and read people like, Blake Morrison writing about his father, wonderful book called When Did You Last See Your Father? Just to sort of explore ways of writing about somebody who died, and also that very complex relationship between a parent and a child. And I say complex not in a bad way, because I think I was lucky enough to have a very loving father, and in many ways our relationship was not complicated, but trying to express that relationship was quite hard. So yeah, the reading was pretty eclectic. But then, as you'll know, you can do as much reading as you like, but there comes a time when you have to concentrate on your own words and your own way of doing things.
Absolutely. Well, you were saying about, a book of remembrance rather than a grief memoir. And to get us thinking a bit more about that, we've got our second archive slot, which is Tom Lee writing in memory of his father.
Tom Lee, in memory. My father died last summer. It was sudden, unexpected. His health was not great. His memory was bad and getting worse, and we'd been trying to get him to the doctor about it for some time. But he was fit enough. The week before he went into hospital, he and I had walked through the woods with a dog and then sat in the park together, and there was no warning that within 3 weeks he might be dead. A few days after that dog walk, when I had returned to London from Essex, he became delirious and had to be taken to hospital in an ambulance. A UTI, the doctors thought, and antibiotics would quickly return him to lucidity. It didn't work out that way. On his third day in hospital, he had a seizure. Then he had another, and another. He was moved from ward to ward as the diagnosis changed and his situation deteriorated. A scan showed that he had had a stroke and there was considerable damage. The stroke ward was closed because of a COVID case, but when they let us in to visit anyway, we knew that he was not going to make it. On and off for the past couple of years, I had been writing an account of a time in 1968 when my father had been in a psychiatric hospital following a breakdown. Ever since I was young, I had heard my father's stories about this period, the larger-than-life characters who he had been on a ward with, the arrogant doctors, the insulin shock therapy that was designed to induce a seizure and relieve him of his symptoms. He had told these stories with relish, and I loved the details. The man, Brian, who had claimed he was the heir to the Mr. Softy ice cream empire. Another man who wrote poetry and gave my father a figure he had carved out of wood. The sudden appearance of Lord Snowdon to take pictures of patients on the ward. My father often said that he meant to write it down, but never did. By this time, I had written and published some work about my own health crises, so I suggested I might write it myself. He seemed to like the idea, and we sat down together to go through it all again. I wrote the piece and sent it to an editor who I'd worked with before and who wanted to publish it. The editor's notes and revisions arrived after my father had been in hospital for a week. I tried to work on them, but it was impossible. For one thing, there was no time. My brother and I were staying with my mother and going into hospital every day, sometimes twice a day. My mind was full, my concentration was shot, certainly too shot to think about the changes I needed to make to the piece. I emailed the editor, who was sympathetic, and we agreed to postpone it to the next issue, or longer if needed. My father died a couple of weeks later, and his funeral was in early September. In the autumn, I felt able to go back to what I had written. It was published in December. It should have felt strange, perhaps. It had certainly been a strange few months. I had not experienced grief in the way I had expected. I loved my father a great deal, but except for in the hospital and when the nurse told us directly that he was dying, and when my brother and I woke my mum to tell her that the hospital had phoned and that he had died, I had not cried. Nor had I experienced the sudden, destabilising waves of emotion that people talk about. In many ways, everything had been remarkably the same. His death an ordinary matter of fact. We had not discussed it, but the editor had given the piece a title, My Father's Asylum. I liked it. It made it belong to my dad. It is a strange kind of in memoriam, I suppose. A record of a very difficult time in my father's life, a time of great vulnerability. He was only 27 years old, just married to my mother. The trajectory of his life, grammar school, Oxford, a PhD and an academic job, had abruptly been halted, the future now terribly uncertain. Now he was institutionalised in a place so stigmatised that his mother would not visit him there. But it was also, in the end, only a small part of his life, a life that included my mother, my brother and I, a long career in academia and then school teaching, a passion for education and for politics. I wrote and spoke about all this in the eulogy I gave at his funeral. In this context, his time in hospital was not worth mentioning. Nevertheless, I think My Father's Asylum shows much about him, his humour, his kindness, his lack of pretension, his lack of vanity, his attitude to the world. Would he have liked this kind of legacy, this strange tribute, this printed and public record of a difficult time? I think he would. He liked telling these stories. After more than 50 years, they had still been vivid to him, still meaningful. He never wrote it all down, but I did.
So, Caroline, Tom Lee speaking really powerfully about working on that particular piece about his father. Lots of different things. Obviously, quite a lot of difference between what you were doing with Listen with Father and what he was doing with that piece. But I wondered what you felt about the question of what your father would feel about the book and whether you felt any responsibility in how you presented his story, how you navigated that. Because obviously he's no longer here, but there are other people who will remember him. And did that play into how you wrote about him at all?
Well, it didn't initially, because I suppose I was just immersed in the business of remembrance and trying to, write about him, as he was, as honestly as I could, and write about the kind of man he was, in many ways, an ordinary, decent man, but with his quirks like any of us. I think really when I started to think about that was when I gave it to my mother to read. And I think, in a way it was both a joy and quite difficult for her to read it, really, because your view of somebody is not somebody else's view of somebody. And obviously, my father, to her was different. He was he was a husband, someone she met when she was 14, and was married to for a long time. So that is quite a strange moment. And I don't think that's to say there was anything contentious about what I'd written. I mean, I think in some people's cases, a memoir can be really contentious in terms of how it's received by other family members, for example. But yes, I mean, I think it can't fail to be a question in your mind and maybe even concern. I suppose the thing, though, is that my mother is in her 90s. My father would have been in his 90s. Had he lived. And, the people that remember him are very, very few and far between now in terms of his contemporaries. So actually there is a sense of wanting to do that as well, it's in memoriam, really.
It's funny because another sort of touch point between our two books is my father died while I was writing Relearning to Read. And he wasn't a big part of the story, but actually his father was quite a big part of one of the chapters. And I did mention his death in the final chapter because it actually slightly affected the final chapter and the writing of it. And I found that I was glad to be able to include him in the book and, in fact, to dedicate it to him. But there was also a strange kind of release in an odd way, in that I felt less anxious about what I'd written about my grandfather, because I felt my father was not going to be reading it and perhaps disagreeing with what I might have written. Although what I wrote was not at all contentious, as you say, I felt there was a degree of, this feels like I can tell this story now in a way that perhaps I couldn't more so easily when he was alive.
Yes, and that makes absolute sense. I mean, my work in progress is inspired by the story of my forebears, a couple of generations back. And so there's a distance there, which is, I guess is liberating, even though you've kind of, in some senses, you come directly from them. But yes, and I mean, I think this is why a lot of people leave writing memoirs until people have died, because I think it's that thing about writers having to be, in some sense, dispassionate or clear-eyed, and having that tiny kind of chip of ice, which means that you have to face up to, difficult things. I think it was the writer Peter Porter once said something about, you can't write a good memoir without spilling a little blood. You can't sort of embroider things. You can't sort of, have your rose-tinted spectacles on, and that's a very salutary thing to think about. Although I don't think I had to spill very much blood. But
no, I mean, he comes across as such an intriguing, warm, kind person in the book. The picture that you paint of him, and someone who really loved sharing his passions and really took joy from seeing other people being lit up by
Yeah, he was quite an insular man, and one, I mean, he had his kind of hang-ups. I mean, he wasn't particularly life and soul of the party in any way. But I suppose that was part of it as well. I mean, we read there's a lot of memoirs out there about terrible, difficult parents. There's so much kind of drama about people at the extremes. And in a way, I think I wanted to write about a parent who was there for me and was just trying to be, a decent human being. And, in retrospect, I admire him very much for that, even down to good manners. And he used to, if we were walking side by side on a pavement, he would always want to walk on the outside. And I used to think, that's such an old-fashioned thing to do. I'm a feminist. But actually, when I think about him now, those things are very much, made up the human being he was, which is,
Yeah, no, it's a very warm tribute and a very engaging one, and it was a real pleasure to read. So, coming to the end of the show now, we have our technical slot. And I wanted to ask you, Caroline, about social media, because I know as writers we can often feel under pressure to be out there on social media, to get our presence out there. And it's something I struggle with a bit, because I have to do it because some of my work is blogging and I have this online community that I'm part of, but I don't always feel very comfortable with it. And I find it can be quite distracting, and finding a way to balance that with the writing life. I wonder how you do it. I wonder whether as a journalist there's a certain obligation to have a presence, or whether you don't feel that. But also, I think you have a degree of success on it, because it was you tweeting that persuaded me to support Listen with Father, because it was crowdfunded, wasn't it, as part of its publication journey. So, I just wondered what your thoughts were about that, how you navigate that.
Well, it's multifaceted, isn't it? I mean, there's no doubt that it can be very useful. And the things that I really love about social media, at its best, it's a real community, and it's also a great information source. And it's where I'm connected to a lot of other writers. And I think, because as a journalist, I'm lucky enough to this position of wanting to amplify other people's work and, shout about the books that I really love, then social media is a great way of doing that. And I know that it means a huge amount to writers when you do that for them, particularly if they're debut writers. And, it's very nice to be in this position of a few words from me being great. That's really helpful. And I love to do that. But it's a strange thing. I mean, I sort of do feel slightly, I should be doing more. But I go through times when I really don't have time to do it. I go through times when I lose my mojo with it. And I think that as writers, I have very much the kind of public-facing side of my work. And by that, I mean my journalism that's published on a regular basis, my festival work, my chairing, my, talking to other writers. I'm very gregarious in one sense. And I suppose the social media belongs to that sort of side of my work. But as a writer myself, I really do have the sense, particularly when I'm actively working on a book, of wanting to put some distance between myself and that, because while the ideas are in my head, I don't really want to share them. I don't really want to talk about them. I need to kind of work them through myself. And I think when I'm in that sort of frame of mind, or that stage of something, I do find it a bit of an intrusion. So the problem with it is you kind of can't go in and out of it. The most successful people on social media are sort of consistent, and you get to know them and what they're offering. And I think that's what I find quite hard, the consistency, because there are definitely times when I just think this is, not what I want to engage with right now.
And it can feel quite exposing or uncomfortable, can't it, sometimes? I mean, I find sometimes I think, I don't really want to be present here. I want to step back and have...
Well, I think most writers have a side to themselves that's really quite private.
Absolutely,
it has to be, I think. And I think I'm quite a strange, people who know me really well, I think would say that I'm quite a strange combination between somebody who is very much heart on their sleeve, very open, very sociable. I'll talk to anybody. And yet there's a side to me which, that I don't... That I keep for myself. I love being at home. I love working on my own at home. I'm quite a solitary. I suppose, aren't you called an extrovert, introvert, or the other way around?
Yeah, an ambivert, I've heard it called.
An ambivert. That's definitely me. And I think that is actually the case with a lot of writers. And actually you have to become that, because you have to be able to cultivate the social, the public-facing side of you to be successful. But if you did that all the time, then what would happen to the writing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes you can spend sort of 15 minutes composing a tweet and think, I could have actually been writing during that time.
Half an hour reading other people's tweets.
Absolutely.
And yes, what could you have got done in that time? A lot. You know, you could write a lot in half an hour if you put your mind to it. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Caroline. We're now going to go to Doug Johnston with the Royal Literary Fund News.
A children's novel about wolves and a detective story featuring an octogenarian sleuth are among the latest publications from Royal Literary Fund Fellows to hit the bookshop shelves. Teresa Heapy's first novel for children, Will Wolfheart, which is illustrated by Adam Beer, has been published by David Fickling Books. Meanwhile, Susan Fletcher's The Night in Question has been released in paperback by Penguin. The story follows Florence Butterfield, who has been keeping a secret for 70 years, and the book has been praised by another RLF fellow, Claire Chambers, as a wonderfully warm and involving page-turner. Rukhsana Ahmed is co-hosting a podcast series spotlighting the voices shaping the future of British South Asian theatre. Each episode of The Next Act centres on a conversation with a playwright, examining their creative process and the political, personal and artistic forces that inform their work. Alongside co-hosts Dr Jaswinder Blackwell-Pal and BBC broadcaster Sharoma Silva, Ahmed will interview guests including Sonali Bhattacharya and Neil D'Souza. For more details, visit thenextact.co.uk. Play by an RLF Fellow has featured in the National Theatre's Connections 2025 Festival. Satinder Chauhan's Mia and the Fish was performed by pupils from Abbey Grange Academy in Leeds as part of the annual programme to encourage teenagers to stage new plays by UK writers. A modern retelling of the ancient Indian myth Manu and the Fish, the play will be published by NT Connections. See nationaltheatre.org.uk for more information. And finally, 2 RLF Fellows have received travelling scholarships from the Society of Authors. Sally Bailey and Jasbinder Bilan are among 5 recipients of the award, which aims to support British writers to engage with writers abroad. The other 2025 winners are Marcus Field, the collaborative duo Montenegro Fisher and Natalie Ola. Travelling scholarships judge Philip Terry said, "All writers need to travel, and the travelling scholarships help them do just that. It's a particularly exciting prize as there are no limits on the kind of work it supports. For more information, visit societyofauthors.org. And now, back to the studio.
Right. Well, Caroline, it's been such a fascinating discussion. Thank you. I really loved Listen with Father, and I heartily recommend it to listeners. If you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make, or any things that you would like Royal Literary Fund Fellows to discuss in future episodes, please contact us on social media using the hashtag RLFcollected. Thank you. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFcollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.